This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. I will be speaking about the concept of justice and fairness with sociologist Stephen Rytina, and the conversation will begin in a moment. And we will be talking about the concept of justice and fairness. As I usually like to do, I want to give my guests a few minutes to introduce themselves. So welcome, Stephen. If you could give me a little bit of background about yourself, things you have written on the subject of justice, and your general opinions.
Okay, sure. Let's see where to start. I'm a sociologist. I have been at McGill for about 25 years. Before that, I was at Harvard. I did my education in Michigan, which was the place where I grew up. And my concern with justice began really in graduate school. I did a study along with Lee Hamilton, first of all, on perceptions of the severity of crimes and the seriousness of crimes, and the severity of punishments that ought to accompany them. And we found a basic pattern of proportionality, which runs through justice studies quite generally. The proportionality is one of the key things that lots of people, their sentiments gravitate toward. Also, at that time, I did a study along with Bill Gamson and Bruce Fireman, which resulted in the book that you mentioned, Encounters with Unjust Authority. And there, the simplest way of summarizing that is that what we were interested in was the Milgram experiment, the notion that people will not disobey authoritative figures except under fairly extreme conditions. I mean, basically, you found unconditional compliance to be a fairly sound generalization. And to put it bluntly, we didn't really like that image of human nature all that much. We wanted to see if we could generate a counterexample. And the key to generating a counterexample was to have people do it in groups rather than as isolated individuals. However, it did also show, that research very much showed, that people have a lot of trouble reaching a shared perception of injustice and of resistance to injustice. That is, we built a scenario which, quite frankly, when we started, we thought it's inconceivable that anybody would think this is anything but unjust. And instead, what we discovered is that about half the groups were able to come together with that vision of the situation and resist it, and about half of them were not. So it was by no means universal that people would succeed in those perceptions. And, we came away with believing that Milgram really had it right in a substantial way, that isolated individuals had to face a very difficult situation in deciding that a particular authority figure is engaged in unjust behavior. Now, that is something that I followed up in some of my later writing. It's the idea that justice in many circumstances rests on intangibles that people don't have very clear ideas of. And so they simply go along with the situations that they find themselves in, more or less attributing to them, sentiments of fairness and all that sort of thing. But close scrutiny is something that's really quite challenging for folks. Well, after that, my subsequent career really centered on issues of stratification and social mobility. And so I concluded it with a book-like manuscript that I completed a couple of years ago that was essentially around the theme of stratification derives and is grounded in social networks. And as a consequence, we're embedded in a world of shared inequality, which is in fact a unitary world, a one-dimensional world, not multi-dimensional, as people have said, and not particularly subject to competing perceptions. I mean, people can see what they want, but there is actually one singular social world that we happen to co-occupy. And so I was able to implement that to actually measure it and so on and so forth. And that gave me a new overview of what the nature of stratification was, that it's more coherent than a lot of people have previously said, and that it's not fundamentally a psychological phenomenon at all. It is actually a structural, or it's a deep regularity that runs through social life. So the end of my career was much more on studies of social structure in that way, not so much on justice, although justice is a counterpart of that. And so I eventually moved on to the social mobility aspect of things. So hopefully that summarizes something of my interests. They were
Yeah. And that's a lot to unpack. Let me, before I go and start just talking about in general broad strokes justice and get into some of
Okay.
the things you said. Let me just go back to Milgram. For those who don't know, we're talking about Stanley Milgram and his famous experiments. I think it was in the 50s or 60s, where he'd have someone sitting in a room with a button, and if he pressed the button, and someone would say, "You must press the button because this person has been bad," and somewhere off, someone wasn't really being tortured, but if the button was pressed, you'd hear, oh, moans of scream and pain and whatnot. Correct?
Yes. Yeah, there were variations on that. I mean, he started with simply stating that there was another person at the other end of it. The most extreme version of it, if I recall correctly, is he required the subject to hold down the hand of a Confederate, and it was simulated. It wasn't really happening, but the perception was you're physically torturing someone. You're collaborating in physical torture of a human being.
Yeah, and it was basically based upon the idea of the Nazis, that
Yes.
They made me do it. I was just following orders.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, it did illustrate. I mean, there's some question about how much we can extrapolate from that, but it did illustrate that the capacity of authority figures to gain compliance is really quite expansive, and the difficulty, and this is again what our research showed, and which Milgram stressed, but most people who read his work, I think, find this hard to believe, and that is that the subjects don't perceive the situation the way we do. They have a very different perception that their job or obligation is to follow the commands that they're given, and it is not their obligation to judge whether those commands are appropriate, which is unfortunately, a terrible failing on their part. And that most of us, when we see that sort of situation, say we can't easily imagine that you would not perceive what you're doing in the same terms that we do, but people don't. They see the relationship to the authority as sort of overriding their personal responsibility for what's going on.
Well, let me just step back and toss out two terms that seem to have been lost in modern day usage, and that is commonweal and the social contract. And when I think of justice, we think of rights, the Bill of Rights, the enumerated rights and whatnot. And as much as we'd like to say that rights are there and that they're as real as anything, aren't we really talking about rights, whether they're civil or human rights, as social fictions that serve a good purpose?
Well, I mean, they're fictional, but not really, meaning that there are actual practices in the world. Some of them are quite hideous. We can look at concrete situations, especially labor situations, where people are coerced or treated very unfairly by almost any standard you can imagine. Lots of agriculture has practices. The most extreme versions, of course, were slavery. And slavery was a very unpleasant set of arrangements that nevertheless were seen by some folks, mostly the beneficiaries, as actually reflecting justice conditions. So the possibility that people will misperceive or flatter themselves with perceptions of justice in situations that others see differently, that's very much a reality of it. And that's something that I've always stressed, in some of the writing that I've done on this, is that what counts for justice in a given time and place is a historical settlement. It's something that reflects the outcome, typically of often violence featuring struggles between groups. So that slavery, for example, is the permanent subordination of one racial group to another racial group, and that was inflicted on them through the use of force. I mean, there's simply no historical doubt about that. Then we have other kinds of arrangements where we live in our society and we somehow imagine ourselves to be part of a society in which something like the social contract you speak of applies, and then it came into being. And I mean, you say the question, well, where did we get our social contract that says, for example, and here's an illustration, says, for example, that men and women are equal, or doesn't, okay? Because, in fact, they're not actually treated equally in the society that we've got. That's an ideal that many of us have, and we think that that would be an appropriate way to do things. And we think, for example, that in labor markets, that equal pay for equal work is a justice principle, and that, that impartial treatment of equivalent acts and activities is something that's central to justice. So that on the one hand, we believe we know what would be just, and in that particular instance, we suspect that the arrangements that people are currently experiencing could be improved upon. Okay, so we have a social contract. The social contract states, for example, something like equal treatment for equal contributions in labor markets. We don't believe that that really holds. That is, we can find places where we think it's imperfect. Now, we also have an additional feature of that social contract, which some would contest. And this is the question of, for example, yes, but what is the relative worth or value of different kinds of work? And if you belong to a labor union, what you do is you band together with a bunch of other people and you would try to insist, possibly through strikes or other kinds of conflictual behavior, that your particular kind of work is worth more than somebody would otherwise say. So that, this notion of what the fair or going rate is subject sometimes to renegotiation by different groups. So we can't take for granted that there's a singular social contract that holds across all instances. We oftentimes find ourselves in the middle where we say there's an ideal social contract, and it's not the one that is presently in practice. And so in the historical backdrop, you discover that the terms of trade of the social contract are often set by conflict between groups. And so they're not given or somehow inevitable. However, many people in many times and places see the kind of social exchanges that are authorized and common in their environment, and they see those as appropriate, and they think that they're somehow moral. I mean, a not uncommon belief is that there's a deity or something of that order who proclaimed that certain groups should own the land and other groups should work on land. And they're probably, not to get too theological about it, but the notion that the deity is responsible for social arrangements is a little bit self-exculpatory for those who are beneficiaries of it. But we do discover that there are sentiments of fairness and rightness that come to surround any sufficiently persistent social arrangement. And that's the flaw of justice thinking, is that justice sentiments don't necessarily follow justice ideals. Justice sentiments are also, to some significant degree, shaped by what is. And what is tends to attract the sentiment of justice.
So, Stephen, I wanted to ask, when you just mentioned about the different justice, are we talking about social justice warrior types? Was that what you're referring to, that they have these? No.
Yeah. No, that's an interesting point. And I mean, justice is the perception typically. I mean, there are a variety of different versions of it, but sort of a common denominator here is that there's equivalent treatment of equivalent, and here you can plug various things in here. People are interested in activities, labor is especially an important one, where who gets rewarded, how much for what they do is a very central concern of justice. So justice is around the question of which inequalities are appropriate. And there's general sentiment then. People have both observations or opinions about the actual inequalities that hold and whether or not those are the ones that should hold. So built into this then is typically various kinds of notions of what counts as equivalence, what people deserve equal treatment and what people deserve unequal treatment, because it's about how to fairly allocate over unequal contributions. Now, social justice warriors typically then are people who state some group or another, perhaps one they belong to, perhaps one they sympathize with, is being unfairly treated under current arrangements. And so they believe that what they should do is undertake various political projects or social movements or what have you to improve the relative treatment of some group or another. Black Lives Matter is a very clear illustration of this. It says that the police should behave the same way toward people of different races, not unequally toward people of different races. And so that's the assertion that police treatment is influenced unfairly by skin color. Belief that I certainly share, and I think many people do. And so people who oppose certain kinds of now you see that, I mean, it's immediate to say unjust treatment, and unjust just means unequal on grounds that we do not support. So justice is what kinds of different treatment or inequalities are considered appropriate and what kinds are considered inappropriate. And the illustration in this would be like, most people would agree that if someone, say, attacks a police officer, the police officer is certainly entitled to hit them over the head with a club and defend themselves. So, there are circumstances in which it's fully appropriate for various people like police officers to be quite unkind to people because they deserve it. That's similar to the material that I spoke of. I mean, most of us have various theories of behavior that we call crime. Yeah. And we think that crime should be punished, and we think it should be punished proportionately to what the person did. So that most of us are perfectly willing to agree that murder is a very inappropriate activity and that very severe sanctions should be handed out. And most of us agree that car theft is also an inappropriate activity, but that it's not nearly so serious as murder, and so that it ought to receive a proportionally less severe outcome. So justice is about putting proportions together in treating unequal conditions. And so treating, we approximately believe that if two individuals are found guilty of car theft, that they should get similar outcomes. They should be treated similarly. But they should be treated dissimilarly from people that did other kinds of things. So there are theories that are in the background here that resemble your social contract, where it's like, here are the rights and obligations of various folks that are specified in an abstract way, so that we can say these kinds of labor are equivalent, these kinds of labor are more valuable than others, and so on and so forth. So we have all these assorted theories. Again, labor markets are very rich in this. This notion that different kinds of work deserve different rewards is something that is a sentiment that's very widely shared. And there's some significant degree of consensus on what the more valued jobs are. Now, whether or not that consensus is fully appropriate or fully justified, the answer is no. I mean, historical study would show that a significant amount of it arises out of historical arrangements, and that we discover that it's different in different places, which is the clear earmark that there's no inevitability to it, even though we see it as inevitable. An illustration of this is that, for example, in the former Soviet Union, the role of medical doctor, which is very highly valued in our society, it was mostly carried out by females, and it was significantly less highly valued, even though it required a great deal of education. It obviously was very helpful and important to people. I mean, when you're sick, you really are glad to be able to see a physician who can help you out. But the value that is placed on it by society, by the collective sentiment, and therefore by the pay levels and such like and so forth, was considerably less advantaged.
Let me just ask you on that specifically, because that's an interesting point I've never heard of before. Do you think that in the Soviet Union it might have been that because here we've heard about doctors with a god complex, and usually they're male, whereas in the Soviet Union, when I've seen Soviet films with women in medical things, they seem to be, I don't know, I wouldn't say servile, but they seem to be more in a servant role as doctors rather than the god complex. Do you think that there was a macho element there?
Well, I would put it the other way around. I mean, in American society, the role of doctors has been just massively celebrated, and they have been very, very successful in collectively organizing to limit who can engage in their activities. They organized medicine managed to create a monopoly over a whole series of activities. Writing prescriptions is a good illustration. Only physicians can write prescriptions. Well, they've changed that slightly because we've had labor shortages, so now nurse practitioners and so forth can do some of those roles. The point is that they monopolize certain valued activities, and on that basis, were able to claim for themselves a very high proportion of social honor and money. Okay, so they were successful, and this is the point. In the background of these things, you discover that there's histories behind this, that more effective and less effective collective organization lie behind greater and lesser shares of rewards for various activities. So it's not inevitable or built in what the fair portion will be for the different activities. Instead, there's a historical record. Now, against that backdrop, one does have to add, it's difficult to imagine a society that doesn't somehow reward, for example, more scarce skills that are, more difficult to acquire. It's just that the exact schedule of rewards that's used is by no stretch of the imagination inevitable. If we look at it historically, we discover that there's been, great oscillation in, for example, the relative value of, I'll take an example that's near and dear, the relative value of sociologists and lawyers. Most people find this hard to imagine, but as recently as the 1960s, sociologists entering the labor force, which meant as assistant professors, were paid more than lawyers. And it's like, what? I mean, of course, recently, laws has been very substantially elevated. It's much more lucrative right now. And so these different results come about because of a series of changes. I mean, you can attribute it, if you wish, to labor markets, but from a sociological point of view, that's somewhat naive. Labor markets don't operate autonomously or produce automatic results. They're manipulated by various political actors.
Well, let me just ask you about the sociology versus law thing. Is that because it's easier to see the tangible benefit that a lawyer brings versus a sociologist? Just as in the same way, it's much easier to see an entertainer, say a musician or a baseball player, and the baseball player hits a home run, but a great artist who maybe is a great painter or a great musician, or a great whatever, it's harder to see the tangible benefits. Do you think that the lawyers, because, I just won $250,000 when I sued the guy next door, it's easier to understand for most people?
Well, you could say that, but I think on a very substantial measure I wouldn't. And that is that, if you can manage to convince people you're doing it. I mean, an example of this sort of thing, however, is that I always use the example of airline pilots. My strong preference is to have highly skilled pilots whenever I'm a passenger in the plane, obviously. However, my understanding of what's actually involved in the job is that it's very nearly automatic. That is to say, the computer pretty nearly could fly the plane, and that you don't actually need someone who's particularly skilled, except for those very rare instances, the Sully-Sullenberger thing, where it's like, we're going to land the plane in the East River, and it's really great. Have somebody there who's really unusually skilled. That's fine. So it saves your life. It's very important. So the point is that a number of these occupations are surrounded by myths, and that we come to believe because we see films or something like that they have special roles, and that doesn't have to be grounded in reality. But some of it is not, and so that the point is that when we look at these different outcomes for different groups, we have to realize they're not inevitable. And it's arguing against the inevitability is the major point that I'm trying to make, is to say that you can find historical instances of change in these different sorts of outcomes. It's easy to convince oneself, and there are people that have been wholly convinced of this, that the actual order of valuation over jobs is in some sense intrinsic, and is in some sense derivative of an actual social necessity. And the argument against that is that it's not that consistent across different times and places. So if it truly was technological, we'd find probably higher degrees of consistency. But I should stress, that's a somewhat controversial point. There's a whole school of people that insist that it is actually convergent across different societies. I don't personally think their evidence is all that great.
Stephen, I want to get back to the idea of race here. You had mentioned it a bit earlier, sure. And there's a couple of things, but I want to just pick up on one point that I think is very relevant now, and that's race and modern social media and the idea of justice. Over the last few years, we've seen a lot of things on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube where people with their cell phones have captured, say, a black person being beaten by a cop unnecessarily. Just a couple of days ago, there was, I forget where, maybe it was Pennsylvania, some guy had shot someone, ran into a bar, or shot someone in a bar. A black guy who was there, who's a security guard, detained the fellow, pinned him to the ground. The cops came in, shot the black guy rather than the actual shooter, and the guy died. We've seen where A lot of people, especially white women, will be calling on black people who are just walking by or standing on a corner. They're scared of, oh, there's a black man standing there, and this kind of nonsense. Now, years ago when I was growing up, I was born in 1965. This kind of thing, if it ended up in any media form, would have been on maybe page 47 of the local news. It was, and it would be there for one day and people would forget about it. So but now almost every incident is thrown in the face as though this is something new, a new phenomenon, when it was just the technology wasn't there. Has social media, do you think, helped elevate the ideas of justice or bring injustice to the fore, or has it sort of drowned itself in the totality of how many incidents are recorded?
Well, I mean, I think that improved communication is probably an important source of social improvement. I mean, you need knowledge to react to these situations. And so, this gets down to the question of, is the world in fact improving? Is it arcing toward justice? I'm enough of an optimist to say, yes, I think so. I think that we are slowly but surely. Incidentally, one of the conditions that leads to justice is assigning to people the ability to withdraw from situations that they find to be unattractive to them. So freedom, the ability to choose which circumstances you'll subject yourself to, and the ability to opt out of undesirable circumstances has probably, I think, increased over the last several hundred years. More and more people have more and more ability to reject situations, to withdraw from situations that are undesirable to them. Now, some of this is also attached to the fact that societies are becoming wealthier. As a consequence of this, people's realm, the ability to self-actualize, to take over your own existence and be responsible for it increases. I mean, when people are starving, they will subject themselves to all sorts of terrible conditions because the alternative is death. And there is still starvation in the world, to be sure, but it is probably declining a bit. The world probably is getting wealthier. This is a difficult problem because it's not happening the same across the entire population of humanity. And so you really do want to be careful about it. I mean, the conditions in North America and in Europe are far more favorable than in most parts of the world, and that is something that we should never forget. Nevertheless, there does appear to be a general trending where people are living longer, they're wealthier, they're healthier, and they're more able to reject situations that are undesirable to them. Now, you could immediately add at this point, there's those poor folks who are walking, we believe, up from Central America to get away from conditions that are just horrific, in the hopes that they'll be able to, join North American societies. I kind of wish them well. I mean, they'd be much better off if they could. And that illustrates that, yes, the ability to leave is there, and it allows at least some people to improve their existence, but it's not universal by any means. There's lots of people left behind, and there are lots of people forced to endure situations that are really that many of us believe we wouldn't put up with, and we kind of wish that they could get away from. So the ability to withdraw is crucial. It probably has increased. That suggests then that judgments of what's appropriate are having more force in the actual world, that people are able to undo circumstances that they think are unfair. And again, one of the kinds of examples that would be of considerable interest: can people change their jobs if they wish? Can they improve on their jobs? Can they alter their living circumstances if they wish? Or are they forced to put up with, abusive circumstances? And, those abilities probably have increased. More people are able to leave behind. I mean, interpersonal abuse is not something that's really central here, but it is sort of an example. I mean, folks that have to put up with housing additions, relatives that beat them, that sort of thing. And, it's like, that's probably unfair, that's unjust. When was it possible for people to withdraw from that? And the answer is, well, you had to have some measure of economic independence. So if we go back to, say, the 19th century, we discovered, lots of people were forced to stay in households that were, by our standards, highly undesirable, because otherwise they had no means of livelihood. And now it's much easier for people to exist independently. again, especially in North American European society, if you go to other more rural societies, people are forced to remain within kinship circumstances, and they're routinely abused. Physical abuse is fairly common in these circumstances. This is a bit of an aside. With some colleagues, I recently have been engaged in a study in Senegal, and one of the things that we discovered in Senegal, this was really quite amazing. We happened to ask the question of, is it appropriate for a husband to beat his wife? And the remarkable result was that fairly substantial pluralities of the public there thought that it was appropriate. And even more remarkable from our point of view is that females were more likely to endorse marital violence than were males. And so, it's a circumstance that is quite different, where the dependency of females on males is much more deeply ingrained and much more accepted, because there's, again, that's built into their living arrangements. Membership in a household is a necessity for food. If you're expelled from a household, you don't have access to food, and so it's like, ugh.
Well,
we can't easily imagine what it's like to live in a society that's like that. It's a very different, and they're vastly poorer than we are. So this notion that you could just walk out and get yourself a wage labor job, that doesn't exist.
Is Senegal, by the way, a Muslim country?
The place where we were was, let's see now, it was about 1/3 Muslim.
Because the reason I ask is, there's the idea here in America that you have a lot of capital F feminists who will not decry Islamic abuse of women, because of Islamic law, because they see that as a cultural hegemony, that our culture is imposing something on another culture. And there seems to be an innate hypocrisy in that kind of idea of justice, where you have women in the West not standing up for women in Muslim societies because they don't want to be seen as sort of, the white man's burden or the white woman's burden,
yes.
I guess.
Well, look, that's a difficult issue. I don't happen to sympathize with the position that you're outlining, and I certainly hope it's not very widespread. But, somewhere in here, there is a real problem, cultural relativism. Yeah. And, do we have a right to impose? I personally think we do. It's a difficult question. Do we have a right to say that, for example, the use of coercion in social relations should be minimized? And, I think that is a universalistic position, not simply a Western position, but it does undermine certain kinds of arrangements that I happen to think deserve to be undermined, generically patriarchal kinship arrangements where males are presumed to have a great deal of authority and power over females, and that's taken to be appropriate. And I don't think that's appropriate in a similar sort of way. And here again, we see changing norms. Not so very long ago, when I was growing up in Ohio in the 50s, it was considered appropriate for parents to physically discipline children. Now, the support for that is declining over time. It's now considered to be pretty inappropriate, and I strongly suspect it would be a rather interesting thing to get direct information on, that if you went into, say, a supermarket with, say, a 6-year-old and you started wailing on the kid, that people would report you nowadays. They would intervene. They would not stand by and allow that to be. And I'm pretty confident that when I was a child, that was pretty standard behavior, and that people would have thought that it was interfering. So it's somewhat similar to the example you're doing. Do we allow parents to discipline children physically? And the answer is, once upon a time, that was considered to be an obligation of appropriate parenting. And most of us now are, no, we do not think it is appropriate to physically discipline children, except perhaps under very severe conditions.
And similarly,
the sentiments change.
Yeah. Similarly, we could imagine, say, in 100, 150 years, that people would look back at us having these factory farms and animals kept in terrible conditions, and they say, yes, they actually tortured these creatures so they could eat them, rather than whatever, if we're able to grow meat eventually and whatnot. And so, people will talk about someone like a Lincoln being a racist, and it's like, well, yeah, he was, but the very fact that he was able to, in some ways, transcend that innate racism, he was racist, excuse me, that's what makes him a great person, not the fact that he had some of the flaws of his own society.
Well, quite exactly. You see, this illustrates something that I think is very important to bring into this conversation, is that you need a sense of history.
Yeah.
You need a sense of how there has been real shifts. I mean, if we go back to, say, several hundred years ago, well, actually, it's much more recent than this, and I don't know the exact history of this, but it was part of the labor struggles of the 1930s that it was considered routine for four people to physically strike employees. So that, you know, the notion that your foreman could beat you if they didn't like your performance was taken as a normal prerogative in, for example, the automobile factories in Detroit. And after the labor unions got in place, one of the things that they militated against is they said physical abuse of employees should not be allowed. Now, I think to most of us today, it's almost unthinkable that you would take a job and that your boss would be entitled to strike you because they didn't like your performance.
Yeah.
But not so very long ago, that was, in fact, the way things actually operate. So we see an increasing, you know, respect for the dignity and integrity of other human beings. And it's not inevitable. And we're probably not at the end of that process. We're probably going to get nicer still as time goes on. So is humanity getting more gentle? And I happen to believe that you can make a pretty good case that as a result of, and one possible major factor in this is that we live in closer quarters. We're urbanized. And urban people have to learn how to accommodate close quarters of other folks. And so we learn how to manage our emotions. We don't hit each other nearly as much as rural people do. And rural people are much rougher.
Well, growing up in New York, you know, I'd have neighbors that would be, you know, if the music was too loud at night, they'd be like, you know, you son of a bitch, you goddamn motherfucker, I'll kill you, blah, blah, blah. And these people would yell back. Then in the morning, they'd come out and say, hey, how you doing, Joe? You know, and they would get it out, but it wouldn't be this, like, I must kill this person. There would be the initial outburst of violence, but it was almost sort of like a routine. It wasn't real.
Yes, yeah, it's just communication. And I mean, you know, look, apartment buildings is a whole other story. You're quite right. People yell at each other, and you know they do that, and that's especially true. I mean, you know, I had relatives in New York City when I was growing up, and so I used to spend about a week a year there, and I was amazed and appalled by, you know, you go out to the Corvettes, I think it's the box store, and you see husband and wife, you know, just going at it in the aisles, and it was like, you know, people, they act as if they're surrounded by utter strangers because they are surrounded by other strangers. You know, they're just completely shameless, some of them. But that notwithstanding, I mean, the more general sociological theme is that we've seen an increase in manneredness. That is, people are more socialized. We invest more time. By the way, I mean, one of the pieces of this, and as someone who lived in Canada, seems to illustrate it pretty well. The more educated your population is, the more polite they are. They learn, the longer you stay in school, the more you become addicted to following rules and follow more elaborate codes of conduct with respect to how you behave toward others. And so the highly educated populations, of which Norway and Canada are really good illustrations, they're really polite. And of course, the case of Norway is fascinating because, you know, 1,000 years ago, the same genetic material were Vikings. Yeah. They were some of the nastiest people who've ever been around. You know, their basic philosophy of life was we'll sail in our boats and we'll, you know, kidnap and pillage. Yeah. You know, we'll enslave people, we'll steal them away, we'll steal all the goods, we'll just burn things, you know. And that's the ancestors of a group of people that today, of course, are for human beings, very sweet and gentle and nice to each other and so on and so forth. So, yeah, you can change human beings by especially socialization, by education. And the more educated they are, the more they tend to be rule-like and respectful of others. Now, that's a general theme that, you know, I've seen running through this, where I said, I think the humanity is actually improving from the standpoint of becoming more respectful of each other. And that there's, you know, somewhat similar. Steven Pinker famously made this argument. I'm not so sure that I agree with it, because the problem with Pinker's argument is he claims that violence is declining over time. And the problem is that that's true, except that the exceptions of the wars And in the 20th century, the wars were much worse than they were before because industrialization made it possible to kill really large numbers of people very efficiently. And so industrial war is far more horrible than, in fact, pre-industrial war in terms of death rates and various sorts of things. So, World War I and World War II was actually worse than World War I. And so, our capacity to live together has kind of improved. But if somebody ever, unleashes the nuclear weapons that are sitting, they're there, they're ready to go, we could just see a total cataclysm. So we really don't know. We're not at the end of the story. However, that said, I think that there is a general point that in ordinary times, non-war times, people are improving in the way that they treat each other.
I do want to return, Stephen, to that bugbear of social justice, the idea of race and IQ. And one of the things that in America here, when we're recording this in America in 2018, is the idea that somehow certain groups here, mostly blacks, some Latinos, Native Americans, are thought to be less intelligent than Caucasians or whites, with, oddly enough, Asians being on top of the groups, and within the white group, Jews being usually at the top of white groups, the white group as far as intelligence. And people often say that, well, that's why these groups are more successful and whatnot. Yet it seems to me, I just read something online maybe a week or so ago, but that seems obvious to me, and that is that wealth, more than any other thing, is the thing that leads to good education. I.e., you could go to Madagascar, you could go to Vietnam, you could go to Uruguay, and you will see that the wealthiest people in all societies are those that are the most intelligent. In this society, the wealthiest groups have always been white people who are basically, carried over from the landed white males of yore and who had that head start, basically. What is your take on the idea of race, wealth, and social justice?
Okay. Well, the difficulty, I want to do the background here, and that is that from a certain point of view, IQ is a social capacity that is acquired from the environment that you're allowed to live in. That is, it's heavily influenced. The oddity of it is that there's a significant genetic component in the same way that, dogs have effective noses. They also have to be trained. So yes, there's a genetic component, but there's a huge social component that is summarized by a thing called the Flynn effect. And the Flynn effect is that if you look at the history of IQ testing, the tests have to be recalibrated every so often because the average performance improves over time. And so that, and the difference is really quite great. It's the average IQ, if we measured it on a constant scale, has gone up something like 30 points, 2 standard deviations over the last 100 years, say. The massive IQ testing, as a matter of fact, started just about 100 years ago with the Army Alpha test in World War I. And so what we see is that the thing that we measure is IQ, which I would say is IQ. Let's call it that. And, the simplest way to summarize it is, how many words do you know? How large is your vocabulary? And what we're saying is that the size of vocabularies has increased over time, that people know many more words than they did. So, and the number of words that you know pretty clearly, and I mean, again, that simplifies it slightly, but it's a fairly decent indicator of what we mean by IQ. And the number of words you know is obviously influenced by the number of words that are known by the people you talk to. You don't learn these words independently. You learn them because you interact with people who are using them. That's the way most of us acquire most of our vocabulary. So if you insert someone into a social situation where there's a very rich vocabulary being used, they'll acquire more of that vocabulary themselves. Now, there remain individual differences. Some people do that faster than others. And that's the one where we say, that's a relatively bright child or that's a relatively slow child. And we're talking about how under similar circumstances, they're faster or slower at acquiring stuff. However, when we talk about groups, which is what you started with, we have to recognize the fact that certain groups are confined to social circumstances that are significantly beyond their control. One indication of this, in the case of race in the United States, is the fact that there's an accent difference. That's a remarkable fact, that Black people that live in Los Angeles or New York City And therefore, in environments that are substantially white people's environments, speak sufficiently differently that it's child's play to distinguish which community somebody grew up in. And that tells you that those communities are really set off from each other. And so the conversations that people are having, the social interactions that people are having, are confined by racial membership in very substantial degree. And again, the language that people use is a real close indicator of that. If we ever came to a society that was becoming more racially integrated, we discovered that linguistic differences had faded.
And Stephen, if I could just pick up
the same, different people and members of different groups could not be distinguished over the telephone, and we don't live in that society.
And it should be stated that within the Black community in the U.S. today, there's a debate over the naming of children. There are quote unquote Black names, like instead of Marcus, there's Jamarcus or LaMarcus or Latoya, and you have these sort of made up names with piecing together, foreign sounding, and whether or not that is deleterious to Black mobility within the larger society.
Yeah. Well, and see, look, the answer that I come up with is unfortunately a very old one and a very familiar one. What I was indicating by talking about the linguistic difference, which is again fading over time, and so it's not as if there's no progress on this, but it still remains very substantial. And if we look at things like what kinds of schools do people get to go to, we discover that there's still massive segregation by residence, by race. And that people who are members of racial minority groups are heavily confined at very high rates to schools that are very overrepresented, in which they're very overrepresented. So we do not have anything that resembles a so-called integrated society in which racial membership does not influence who you get to interact with, or it influences it less. And so what we discover is that, Black people are, and again, this is declining over time, but Black people are pretty well substantially confined to circumstances where there's mostly other Black people around. That's a statistical thing. It's difficult to summarize for people that are not part of it, that if we could record all the conversations in the world, and we say, to what extent do Black people have to interact face-to-face with other Black people? And it's a large overproportion of their time is spent that way, just as if you're a white person, most of the time you interact with other white people. And you get to do that. You get to do that in family, you get to do it in school, you get to do it in the workplace. So then we end up with the fact that we started with this. We said the richest people tend to have the highest education, they have the highest cultural standards, they live in the most beneficial environments. And they monopolize those in a sense. I mean, they do it somewhat informally, because what you do is you simply set up, say, for example, a residential system where you say, we'll cluster the houses by desirability. So we'll have rich neighborhoods. And guess who gets to live in the rich neighborhoods? People with a lot of resources. And so they get to go live on the Upper East Side, and they hang out with other people on the Upper East Side who similarly have had massive advantages in education, and then they go to school with each other, they marry each other, so on and so forth. And they are, in some sense, actually more effective as human beings because, again, going back to vocabulary, they know more words. If you grow up on the Upper East Side, your vocabulary is going to be enhanced by some significant measure. You're therefore going to be better able to, say, for example, engage in a career in law. It's really useful to have a big vocabulary if you're going to go to law school, et cetera, and so forth. So advantage by groups is very substantially segregated, is a reflection of the fact that people grow up in differentiated environments. And if you have the good fortune to be born into a wealthy family, you end up with a better share of the cultural resources, such as vocabulary, that are valued in our society. And that is a very strong effect on people. And that's what the stratification stuff that I was studying was about. It's that, like, yes, you are, if you're principal breadwinner in your family, one of the drawbacks of the stratification literature is they studied fathers only. They didn't really study mothers, so we don't know about that, or we don't know as much about it as we might. So it's somewhat natural to speak of in terms of fathers, and that's not really correct, but that's just built into what we study. And if you have the good fortune to be born in a family where the breadwinner is, say, a physician or a lawyer, this will increase, for example, the amount of education you're going to get by a couple of years over somebody who's, say, in a blue-collar occupation. And you have a higher IQ. I mean, there's no doubt, because again, you get better SAT scores. Why? The SAT score is measuring your cultural resources. So it's measuring how rapidly you absorb them from your environment. Yes, that's the difference between you and your next door neighbor. And so there are differences like that. But then it's also what neighborhood did you live in? It's very heavily influential on how those scores come out. And that, of course, is something that people don't have any control over. See, this is a sort of central problem. I mean, we reward those abilities because we see them as socially valuable, and we are thereby rewarding ancestry in substantial measure. Yeah. And that's marbled through this stuff. No one has yet come up with a very good solution, maybe any solution, to how we could stop doing that, or how we could minimize the amount of that stuff. Although, again, I suppose we could say that Norway has come up with a pretty good one.
Well, Stephen, I want
you can equalize access to education in a way that we don't in the United States or Canada.
Well, and it's also a more homogeneous society, we have to say, too. So it's easier. It's smaller and more homogeneous. Well, I want to pick up on a point you mentioned earlier regarding Steven Pinker, and then we'll sort of wrap the interview up. And this Pinker point, I think, will bring us back a sort of full circle of some of the things that we've talked about. You mentioned Steven Pinker and his recent studies about the amelioration of human society as a whole. And in one of his passages, or one of the chapters, he talks about, you had mentioned about the world wars and larger violence. I think Pinker's major claim was that in hunter-gatherer societies, there's a higher per capita rate of violence, of murder, of rape and whatnot, than in larger societies. Of course, a hunter-gatherer society might just be 17, 25, 30 individuals rather than 300 million like we have. And I wanted to ask if any studies that you know of or that you may have done have been done on, for example, the justice or the equality levels within societies. For example, in a hunter-gatherer society, everyone has to be a great generalist. You have to be able to make the weapons. You have to be able to know which stuff to eat and which stuff is poison. You have to know which animals are dangerous, which animals are not, et cetera, et cetera. In a modern society, we're a bunch of specialists. Civilization and the agricultural revolution allowed us to be specialists. Someone like you or me who wear eyeglasses would have been fodder for or food for, saber-toothed tigers 10,000 years ago. Yes. But now, because our bad eyesight is not as deleterious to our existence as it would have been to our ancestors, we're able to live and not worry about being eaten by predators. So does a hunter-gatherer society, is that more egalitarian by its nature or not?
Well, yes, but that comes with a mixed blessing. Yes, it's more egalitarian by all our understanding, because there's no way to organize sustained inequality among families. There's no wealth. There's no way that you can segregate the advantages and exclude other people from them. And in that sense, these are idyllic circumstances, except for two major drawbacks. The first, obviously, is that they can't manage their health conditions anything like as well as we can. So they're much more subject to disease and such like than we are. So they have shorter life expectancies. And that's a drawback. I mean, that probably is not a pleasant circumstance to live with. And I don't know what you would do if you genuinely had a choice. Would you, stay in a hunter-gatherer society, or would you prefer to live in a post-industrial society, which is antibiotics and so on and so forth? The second drawback of hunter-gatherer societies is that between groups, there oftentimes is very nasty behavior. The cases that I'm most familiar with in North American Aboriginal populations, so I really don't know how well this generalizes. I mean, I try not to make up evidence that I don't have, but they routinely kidnapped members of other groups, and they would then, one of the common rituals is they would torture them. But if somebody was sufficiently impressive in being stoic as they were tortured, they would decide that they would recruit them into their tribe. And they would stop the torture and say, oh, no, we're going to let you join our group. And I mean, this whole way of doing things, I mean, that when you grab someone from another group, you routinely gave them a hideous death. And it's like, oh, that doesn't sound like a very nice arrangement to be living in, where there's people running around and they did this to each other. I mean, there are cases that we know in the post-European contact where neighboring groups just completely obliterated each other. You know, one group, they went on the warpath for a continual period of time, and they just demolished, they completely destroyed groups around them. So intergroup or inter-village relations under hunter-gatherer society, at least in that case, were really quite unattractive. So they were nicer to each other, and within the tribal group, they organized, you know, they were fairly egalitarian. There was no means in particular, there was no way to segregate wealth and treat the children differently. So they didn't have stratification as we understand it.
Well, let me just end up with a question that I think is interesting, and that is, for you, just as a sociologist, someone who's studied this, and what do you think is the major or one of the major misunderstood or ignored aspects of social justice that needs more public knowledge or scrutiny, if we could end with that?
Well, you know, I think some of the things that I mentioned are ones that obviously I think people would be societies would be well advised to pay more attention to. One is the fact of the ubiquity of inheritance of inequality, the degree to which, you know, there's a widespread belief, especially in North America, that somehow or another this is the land of opportunity, that people are allowed to get ahead on their own merits or fall behind, as the case may be. And that simply is not accurate. The United States is arguably one of the most unequal in the world in the inheritance of life chances. Yeah. And this is not widely understood, and it is not being politically addressed. I mean, and in fact, on all likelihood, as wealth inequality is increasing, that situation is becoming more and more aggravated. And we're not remotely addressing it. We're allowing it to become increasingly worse as years go by. So if I could change one thing about the world, it would be that there would be an undermining of this belief that inherited inequality is somehow either diminished or is unimportant or is uninfluential. It's quite the contrary. And so, you know, that was what, especially, that was sort of my life project in sociology, was to try to underscore the degree to which that was a myth that did not deserve support from people that were going to take an educated view of the world. That, you know, we had major relics of that were still going on.
Basically, that the American dream, as in post-World War II, the American dream of owning a house, having this, that, and the other thing, is a myth. The sort of, if you're a good person, you'll be able to consume more and better.
Well, what happened after World War II, that was a golden era in which basically the transition, the simplest way to summarize it is that lots of people were able to move from the farm, and then the condition of labor greatly improved because the proportion of white collar versus blue collar jobs also greatly increased. So people got this sense, it was like, oh, anybody who works hard or, you know, kind of keeps their act together can get themselves a white collar job and move to the suburbs. And that's because the proportion of the society that was able to live that way greatly increases from, say, 1935 to 1965 or whatever. So yeah, there's a collective improvement, and it's really substantial. What it wasn't was a change in the pecking order among the different families. And that was something that sociology in particular, I think, got quite wrong for a period of time. They didn't recognize that what they were really looking at is that there was improvement and upgrading in the kinds of work that were available to people. And it was a big improvement in life. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And then commensurate with that, there was a great increase in typical wealth levels inequalities that were available to the public, so that, for example, housing size and various other kinds of things, the number of cars you own, the number of consumer goods that you got access to, all of that increases quite dramatically across that period of history. And so people said, oh, I'm getting ahead of my neighbors. And it's like, no, you're not. We're all moving up simultaneously. Mm-hmm. Okay, and there was not a big shifting of position. That really was not taking place. And there was some confusion about maybe that we were approaching a society in which each generation there would be a reallocation of who got the top positions, and that would be done. Again, the myth was we go to school, we compete for various skills and so forth through the education system, and the education system would become the allocation mechanism. Yeah. And what was not adequately recognized was the degree to which that was simply reproducing family differences.
I just wanted to follow up on something you just said, which is interesting. You basically mentioned the sort of keeping up with the Joneses effect. And in terms of social justice, does it matter necessarily the level of overall social justice, or is it social justice as perceived against others?
Well, social justice is always comparative.
Yeah.
And the missing part here. What we say in social justice is we want the inequalities that exist to be handed out fairly. What we don't say is how much inequality we want to tolerate. And that's the collective question. And some of us who are egalitarians say, the real problem is not whether we hand out inequality justly. The problem is inequality. Yeah. And we really would be better advised to reduce it, whether or not we can hand it out justly. So I'm not against handing it out justly, but I think that that's somewhat missed the point, which is whether or not it was a good idea to have it in the first place. Yeah. So you can have a society in which you say there's huge differences available to people. We kind of have one. Some people are going to get hundreds of millions of dollars, a small number of them, because there's not that much to go around. But we have this lottery that if you go and work on Wall Street or something like that, you can get a vast fortune for yourself. And the question of whether or not that's fairly allocated sort of begs the question of, well, what would it be like if we lived in a society where instead of letting anyone have hundreds of millions of dollars, we said, no, we're going to cap that and spread it out more evenly. And would that be a more just society? And the answer is that the framework of justice doesn't really address that. The framework of justice addresses whether individuals are treated in a proportional and equivalent manner, and it doesn't address the question of whether the society as a whole is an ideal arrangement. And so that's the one that you could have additional attention to, where you say, instead of trying for more justice, what we want is less inequality.
Well, let's end it there. I want to thank Stephen Rytina for spending an hour or so talking about the ideas of justice. I will link to your McGill page for anyone who may want to contact you. And again, thank you for your time.
Okay, well, thank you.